You've likely noticed a dramatic increase in recent years in media and public attention related to police brutality and racial bias. Is all that attention offering people good information, or is it skewing their attitudes in ways that can prove more harmful than helpful? Our next guest recently authored a study that focuses on these types of questions. Zach Goldberg is Paulson Policy Analyst at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Mitch.
So we really have seen in recent years that there's been a lot of concern about police and a lot of thought that there's a rising rate of police brutality or a rising rate of racial bias in policing. Is that what helped prompt this study?
Yeah. Well, I noticed, in my dissertation, I did a lot of work on the effects of media coverage, the long-term, relationship between, media coverage of police, of just racism or discrimination and public perceptions of discrimination and racism. And what you do find is that, perceptions of discrimination typically do track media coverage or media mentions of racial discrimination. And what I noticed when I was putting together my analysis of media coverage of police brutality and racism and bias is that since 2014, in just the past, since between 2014 and 2022, there's been more media coverage of police brutality and excessive force than there has been in the entire 60 years, between 1960 and 2013. So really the public, since roughly 2013 has been flooded. It peaked during the Floyd, which was, I guess you could say, the Great Awakening crested during that year. As you could see in the time series data of attitudes, people have become, much more likely to, have just lack of trust in police. They're more likely to think the police are more racist than other groups in society. They have outright negative sentiment towards the police. They will rate on a feeling thermometer running from 0 to 100. They'll rate police in the negative, which is not something we've seen, as long as the American National Escalade Survey has, been in existence. It's something we've never really seen. So, I'm curious. I was curious to what extent, these attitudes towards the police, the perceptions, are they in a way, one, are they influenced by media coverage? And, I'm pretty confident that they are. And second, when people say that police violence is a severe problem, is that because they have a number in their head? They think it is rampant. They think the police are going and, just waking up in the morning and wanting to go and prey on Black people, like there's just racist police running everywhere. And I wasn't really sure. I mean, it could be that even small number of cases, people, ultimately what's a large number is subjective. So I was just curious whether, the people that really think this issue is a severe problem, do they overestimate or do they overstate the problem? Do they think that it's far more prevalent and pervasive than it actually is? And that's kind of what drove me to this experiment. And ultimately, I wanted to see, do those that support defunding the police, do they also hold skewed perceptions about the prevalence and the racial distribution of, I hate to use the term police violence because that's kind of, progressive activist innovation, but I wanted to see whether it's really far more, whether they truly think that this is more common than what the available data suggests. So until this study, we really only had one data point that gets at this, and it was a 2021 skeptic survey, which found that 40% of liberals, for instance, think that 1,000 or more unarmed Blacks were killed every year. So this is why I wanted to do a larger, not just a replication, but I really wanted to go even further. And I measured, people's perceptions of the prevalence of non-lethal force. And I had respondents estimate the percent of the Bureau of Criminal Justice Statistics every 4 years. They release a very massive report where they ask people about their interactions with the police. So I asked the respondents to estimate the percent of blacks, the percent of whites, the percent of everybody that reported being stopped and approached by the police over the past year, whether they have experienced a form of non-lethal force. And it's very, very rare. In actuality, like point of all respondents, I think 3% say they were subjected to some form of lethal force during the previous 12 months. For among blacks, it's 0.7%. So I had people estimate that. That's how my survey began. And what I found is that, for instance, the liberals respondents think that 1 in 5 of all blacks have been experienced reported being subjected to non-lethal force during over the past 12 months. So you have significant overestimates of non-lethal force, which the magnitude of those overestimates being larger among liberals. And then I focus on lethal force, and what I find there is not so much that people overestimate the number, is that people have a very skewed sense of the racial distribution of police killings. So, the average respondent in my sample thought that the majority of people killed by the police were black, when it's the exact it's 55% white that are killed. Whites are the majority, and blacks constitute roughly a quarter. And that's interesting because I don't know if you remember, but in 2020, in July, Trump was pressed as to why African Americans were still being killed by police. And Trump responded, well, there's more white people actually being killed by the police. And he was just skewered in the media for that. But the truth is that the average person doesn't really know that. The average person thinks that, blacks are the modal victim. And it's interesting because it's not surprising, because black victims of police lethal police violence are 21 times, they receive 21 times the mentions in media reports and in news articles. So it's not surprising that people have this skew. They also, given how much attention is given to unarmed cases, they also think half of people shot by the police are killed unarmed, when it's closer, it's 5 to 10%. So that's I thought was revealing, although it does raise the question of okay, do these estimates, does this estimation accuracy or inaccuracy does it matter at all? Does it have any bearing on people's not only their general perceptions of the problem of police brutality, racism, but also the policy preferences they hold? Or is just these estimates that people give, are they just reflective of wild guessing and expressive partisanship? Liberals were wanted to express their commitment to the cause, so they're going to, say that there's a lot of, overestimating police violence is kind of a way of signaling identity or their commitment to the cause. So I was curious, whether if you actually were to show people the numbers, whether they would, update their attitudes accordingly. Would they moderate their appraisals of police brutality and racism? Would they be less cynical? Would they be less inclined to think it's happening everywhere?
One of the interesting pieces of your report that you asked about these attitudes, you found that the perception versus the reality was off, but then you focused on, okay, if you give people the facts, will this change their attitudes?
Yeah, exactly. And what I did was I randomly assigned half of my respondents to see a visual comparison. I do give a cutout example of it in the report. And, it shows their estimates versus the official estimate, or, the best official estimates we have. And I did it to half a sample, and Somewhat to my surprise, because in the literature, the findings are mixed, or at least if you look at the broad view of the literature going back decades, it's kind of mixed whether people do update their perception. So, but I did find that people, and all of these, none of these were like borderline significant. They were all highly statistically significant. Perceptions of police brutality or racism went down about a fifth of a standard deviation, which in the context of an experiment, or especially a social science experiment, it's not huge, but it is something notable and noteworthy, especially for a one-shot, very short experiment. So that I thought was very interesting, but I was also curious as to whether, in addition to updating their perceptions, people also update their policy preferences on the assumption that, well, policy preferences, should be, at least by one theory, tied to people's perceptions of the social problem, or their estimates of the seriousness of the social problem. So if their estimates or their appraisals of the seriousness of the problem comes down, it follows that they could also reevaluate and modify their policy positions. And the effect on policy positions was a bit smaller, a little bit more noisy, but we also do see a significant effect on policy preferences, particularly among those that are more likely to have larger overestimates of these phenomena. So the more you overestimated, the stronger the effect of the treatment on your policy preferences. And most of the sample, overestimate. Like a very small share underestimate. And as say now 70% are kind of in the range where the treatment has had an effect. And what you see is that people are more likely to support increasing, as we were saying at the intro, police patrols, more police patrols on the street. I had one item, I had them play the mayor of a city. They have a $200 million budget. They got to allocate it to social workers, economic root cause type programs, and hiring more police officers and security cameras, installing more security cameras. And what I find is that those that were exposed to the treatment, they did increase their allocations. And it was particularly encouraging to see that Blacks had a pretty large effect. In the appendix, you'll have to check this out for yourself. But the effects on Blacks were fairly large, which I guess has some policy implications in the sense that, I mean, if people are withholding support for certain policies because they are being fed, I guess they're being misled to think that police are everywhere. And here's the thing is that perceptions of police violence and racism or fears thereof among Blacks, they're not static across time. Okay. They vary in ways that track media coverage, just like a lot of our perceptions. So, it does appear that, especially because Blacks and liberals have larger overestimates. So their attitudes are much more subject to being, I guess, corrected. And, you do see some pretty significant increases among Blacks in their support for these policies. You do see a bump among liberals. I think that's notable, especially because for a lot of these experiments, if people do update their perceptions, they don't necessarily update their policy preferences. And I find that in this context, they did both. At least for a large segment of the respondents, the higher you go, the more extreme overestimators, the ones that really gave outlandish estimates, it doesn't seem like they are. It seems like for them, they're more expressing their policy commitments, meaning that their perceptions and their estimates are kind of grafted onto their policy commitments, and the estimates merely rationalize or justify their policy commitments. But for a lot of other people, their policy preferences are tied to their, estimates about the scale of the problem. And if you show them that the scale is actually smaller than they thought, they adjust their their perceptions and their policy preferences accordingly.
Obviously, it's a very significant finding, but the vast majority of the 300 million plus people in the United States are not going to be talking to Zach Goldberg or the people working
No.
with you and having their perceptions corrected. So you offer near the end of the report some recommendations both for the media about different ways that it can operate, and also for people other than the media about how they can respond to this misinformation.
Yeah, I do make an appeal. I mean, you could call it a futile appeal to, news organizations and journalists of how to bring greater balance to their coverage, how to provide contextual information or data, like I did, that kind of puts these types of incidents or these phenomena into proper proportion. I mean, ultimately, police reform could be very much normally desirable, but we shouldn't have to mislead people about the scope and nature of the problem to get there. Unfortunately, media are, their bottom line is ultimately measured in clicks, and viewership, and obviously a narrative, about racist police is definitely something a lot of people, imbibe and and attend to. And so it's definitely not in their interest, or at least their interests are not aligned with giving this more contextual information to put things into proportion, because then it would kind of take some of the air out of the story.
And in their defense, there might be
Yeah.
not a lot of time too. So
Yeah. That as well. And so ultimately, if media journalists aren't going to heed these recommendations, it's really falls onto the civic groups or even police agencies to set up departments to make extensive use of social media tools like community notes to at least combat or try to push back against this type of these misperceptions on social media. And I think really social media is it's one of the hotbeds of this, of police relating, or when these incidents, obviously emerge. Social media, is a buzz. So I think social media is a realm where, it might take an organized effort. It might take police departments creating agencies that combat misperceptions, or even just outside groups to collaborate and really launch a campaign of pushing back on this stuff whenever it arises, because I think the the social consequences of these misperceptions could be fairly large. I mean, I discussed them in my report. It's just it's a disgrace that we've allowed Blacks to be so afraid of police without anybody trying to, really push back and just say that, listen, yes, there is some disparity, but you're more likely to be, struck by lightning. The fears that you have are not really, I guess, warranted by the reality. These types of misperceptions, they do exert pressure on, local councils, municipalities to enact reckless policies to do something, even if it's counterproductive or destructive in the long run. So I do think, we're kind of hamstrung, in terms of reaching the media and trying to get them to cover this issue better. It's going to be on us. It's going to be on, me and others, and even hopefully some more agencies and organizations to come and push back. I don't think this is the silver bullet, but I do think that better information, the provision of better information, could help to I guess it diffuse some of the tensions and the polarization that arises around these incidents.
we've barely scratched the surface of what's a very
Yes.
extensive report. The title of this report is Perceptions Are Not Reality: What Americans Get Wrong About Police Violence. Its author is Zach Goldberg, who is Paulson Policy Analyst at the Manhattan Institute. And Zach, people can go to that Manhattan Institute website and get all the information, see all the charts and data, and learn a little bit more about the experiment and how you conducted it, correct?
Yes, exactly. It's a type of report where the the appendix is almost as long as the main document. So please dive in. There's a lot of good stuff in there, especially in the
All right.
appendix.
Zach Goldberg, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, take care, Rich. Thanks for having me on.